Welcome to Varn Vlog, and at risk of something I've been complaining about lately, which is being a pundit, I want to talk about Project 2025 in a deeper context than the way it is often talked about on left and liberal circles. In liberal and radical liberal circles, Project 2025 is being pushed as an existential threat to democracy. Now, I pointed out that this search for the unitary executive goes all the way back to Nixon, that it almost emerges immediately with the modernization of the executive, moving it from being appointed by the party and the party's leadership, which is the way things still work in most parliamentary democracies, to being democratically decided through primaries and caucuses. Traditions that have been around for a long time, but were not predominant until the DNC fallout in 1968. We're living through a similar time period with similar craziness. In fact, if you want to find something like this, Johnson's the closest, and anything else you're going back almost into the 19th century. But I wanted to talk about what the Heritage Foundation was really doing with Project 2025. Because while I totally believe there's people who want to implement all of it, if it was implemented in totality, it does things from federalizing our labor law, removing labor protections from the federal level, getting rid of key administrative departments, totally revamping the administrative state, passing very restrictive national laws. It's basically a checklist of everything several different sets of conservatives want. It's 900 pages, and I'm sure that Trump's not lying when he says he didn't read it. The man's not known for reading anything that long. And also, Trump's demagoguery and pattern is not to do explicit promises of contradictory policies like Project 2025 does. If all of Project 2025 was implemented, it would be such a danger to the international economic system that you might really see something like a military coup. And I don't mean that it just gutting the, quote, deep state, which is not a unified thing anyway. Yes, Virginia, there is a deep state in that there is an administrative apparatus that is undemocratically accountable, full of career politicians that have their own bureaucratic interest. And leftists and liberals being on the side of the bureaucrats is a very weird thing, although somewhat predictable by certain kinds of militancy that sees bureaucracy as somehow more neutral than other forms of power. That's a Bavarian opinion, and thus a right liberal one, not a Marxist one. We have to control the fucking bureaucrats and apparatchiks. It's our job. But the idea that you could say, get rid of the federal minimum wage, be a workers' party that also bans public sector unions entirely, returning things back to a pre-1970s standard, focus on the unitary executive, etc., would be a very quick way to have elements of the state, not even the general population, turn against you very fast. And a lot of these policies are contradictory. After all, this is a 900-page checklist of everything that different groups of conservatives want, including things like libertarians and cultural conservatives who hate libertarians. You can't give everybody everything, and this document tries to do it. I've talked about for many years now that Trump's form of demagoguery, and I even agree with right-wing libertarian Scott Horton on this, was actually to promise everything to everybody. If you're a peacenik and you listen to a Trump speech, you can think peace, truth, strength, or you can think you're going to get a neoconservative foreign policy. And this even is carried through in the kinds of alternations of who he would appoint to his cabinet, firing people and replacing them with people from radically different factions. Paleo-conservative isolationist, a misnomer in itself, but nonetheless, people who are war shy were being replaced with someone like John Bolton, some of the worst elements of the old Project for a New American Century. So what is Project 2025 really aiming to do if its agenda is that impossible? And why is it something that many liberals have to try to pretend is actually going to be the platform of the GOP when very little of it is actually in the GOP platform. The revamped GOP platform is vaguer on almost all key issues than it's historically been, something that even someone like Bhaskar Sankara has noticed. Well, we have to look at something historically that's happened before, and then we can do some class analysis on this. Going all the way back to the 1970s and the Bircher's attempts to start building with other conservative groups para-institutions that we would call think tanks, or things like academic institutions that were funded by the government, or DARPA and things of the liberal consensus, we see that there is a drive, led largely by petite bourgeois interest in this case, but also by certain Stern Belt developers and by the defense industry. Although the defense industry gets plenty of what it wants from the Dems, so it doesn't really need this from the Republicans in the way that it used to. The Heritage Foundation uses to create a personal database of pre-vetted conservatives who could serve in GOP administrations, so that they could have personnel up to speed and get everyone in place very quickly. And I do think the part of this that would be very real is the part of this that is totally within normal politics, and it's just protected by non-legal norms, which is the replacement of a lot of the administrative state with loyalists. Now, that already happens at the top of cabinets today. I mean, presidents replace department heads with loyalists all the time, but this would be a deep purging, one that we had seen partially in the Bush administration. So it's not even new. The Project for the New American Century tried to do it, but with different issues. Now, the Project for a New American Century dissolved in 2006 and had a kind of bipartisan successor in the Foreign Policy Initiative. And the Project for a New American Century began largely at the American Enterprise Institute, and alumnus of the Heritage Foundation. Sound familiar? Came up with a foreign policy which was based on, quote, neo-Reaganite foreign policy, picked up by people like Robert Kagan and the Crystals. And this actually did lead to the staffing of George W. Bush's administration, largely coming from these groups. So this is an old tactic. All right. Project 2025, though, is incoherent because it represents an incoherence in conservatism that has happened when the neo-Reaganite coalition fell apart for both its foreign policy interests. A constant expansion is no longer in the interest of the American bourgeoisie, and it's destabilizing to American capital interests. And as people like Peter Zeihan have rightly pointed out, I don't love Peter Zeihan's politics, but he's not wrong about this. There's at least a strong portion of the military apparatus who thinks we need to strengthen up for a potential Cold War with China returning. And this has been part of the neoconservative push for a long time. You can go actually see it in, for example, the Clash of Civilizations book by Huntington. But that this is too expensive for the American bourgeoisie, which is largely internationalized anyway, to really push. And it would endanger the entire American manufacturing apparatus, since the American manufacturing apparatus and the Chinese manufacturing apparatus, until recently, were fairly well integrated. COVID broke that apart, and there's been decoupling, mostly led, ironically, by the U.S., not by China. But that decoupling's been severe enough that that a lot of the finishing of American products is now returned to local trade partners such as Canada and Mexico, which was largely probably who we were most integrated with anyway. The cost of shipping components only makes outsourcing that to factories far away affordable in certain situations and with specialty labor. Hence the need for things like friendshoring. But one thing we can learn from Project 2025 that's real is that this posturing that the GOP is a pro-worker party is not what they're signaling to their activist staffers at all. Josh Hawley might take good positions in Congress and call things out, but this is a front. And people who believe it, there are some people who are supposedly nonpartisan who I think should know better, are kind of getting bamboozled. I'll give you an example. Now, I'm not here to say that the AFL-CIO is going to be ideal in what is going on, but I do want to talk about some of what they point out as in Project 2025 because it is there. All right. There are planks that want to make it easier for employers to get rid of unions in the middle of contracts, to ban all public sector unions, which I mentioned, to allow states to ban labor unions entirely, eliminate overtime protections and choose not to follow the national minimum wage, and to eliminate child labor rules which protect children from working in mines, meatpacking plants, and other dangerous workplaces, which they can't totally get rid of because they're federal. These are pro-corporate policies, and these are pro-corporate policies for particular irresponsible sections of the corporate economy too. So when people are telling you that that the GOP is aiming to be a workers' party, that's not the signals it's signaling to its activist base, even if we don't think Project 2025 is something that Trump really wants to implement. And I don't think it is. I've said for years that it's so unstable that it would probably lead to a coup. And I've been following this since 2022, and that it was impossible to implement all of it, even with the replacing of the administrative state. Now, I do think it's not true that Trump had no ties to Project 2025. It's pretty well documented that people like John McEntee and even the parts of the Project 2025 that have recently stepped down, it's pretty clear that this is a project that is larger than the Trumpification of the administrative state, and that its policies couldn't even be achieved by executive order. It would require control of the judiciary, the legislative branch with a supermajority, and the executive to do. It couldn't just be done out of hand. Now, I do think there's a reason why Trump probably A, hasn't read it, and B, is trying to distance himself from it. It's because it's already achieved what it wants to do, which is in many ways to sheepdog a bunch of activists that have opposing interest into a new GOP coalition, like we have seen when Ronald Reagan. And as American political parties are often based on contradictory interest coalitions, and that's very true for the Democrats, and it's also very true for the Republicans, particularly today, the only way to paper over this is a person. But if the policies are too explicit and too explicitly contradictory, Trump's demagogy won't work. This is actually something we saw with COVID, because Trump's COVID policies are pretty much contiguous with what Biden actually did, but Trump's rhetoric around those COVID policies was very different. Even people like Robert Brenner and Dylan Rowley saw this in their apologia/analysis of Bidenism and Bidenomics, theses that I no longer agree with. I'm not sure they would either. They were way too soft on Biden, but they actually point out that the COVID policies are somewhat contiguous, but that Trump had to keep people who were opposed to those policies in his coalition, so had to throw off rhetorical talking points and confusing statements to appease them. Which is true. But it was mostly hot air. Now, it was hot air that had weird negative downstream effects, but it wasn't actually affecting his government policy that much. So liberals have a sense of wanting to point out these things in Project 2025, but we have to also ask ourselves, are the Democrats going to normalize these policies later? Because they've already normalized Trump's immigration policy from 2016 to 2020. They've normalized the wall. They've normalized things that they got activists to go out and risk getting arrested for. They've normalized all that during the Biden administration. They've normalized the tariff regime, etc. So this is not here for me to tell you to listen to these people who are trying to use Project 2025 to get you to defend democracy. I want you to look at this for what it is, which is, yes, there are some true believers who think you can implement this, but for the vast majority of people involved, I suspect one of the reasons why Trump is distancing itself from it, but not totally, is because it was really a way to get highly contentious, different forms of a fractious right wing that are unified only in a person, not an ideology. The cult of personality is papering over the fact that the GOP has lost an ideology after 2006. And while there is a long durée wrestling for power institutions and power that are still going on, it's been going on for almost 100 years, at least since the New Deal. It's also true that this coalition wants to appeal to workers because they are alienated by the professional policies the Democrats have. Democrats' largest growth demographics on college educated people. They realize that. They're no longer actually pursuing the same racial demographic strategy for the same reason. Now, yes, like the black community, particularly educated black women, are a major part of the Democratic coalition. This idea that was going to lead to a progressive future was always false. You're now having normal liberals actually talk about the fact that racially people perceive women and people of color as more progressive than they actually tend to be. Both on both sides of the aisle, but two, that there are real breakdowns in interests. Like the Democratic Party has been pretty good at priorly propping up finance and tech capital, and they've been really well integrated in that, even to the scammiest parts of it. See Sam Beckman-Fried's relationship to funding a lot of the Democrats. But their policies have been so incoherent under the Biden administration that it seems like Silicon Valley is split on where it should go. Similarly, big productive development seems also similarly split on where it should go and breaking away from its normal alliance to the GOP, and has been for a while. So if we do class analysis on this, we see this is a long durée bourgeois realignment, and that there are many ways which progressive federalism pushed by the Democrats themselves would allow for a lot of what people are pushing against in Project 2025 to happen anyway. If you let labor law be a matter of states' issues, not only do you have the problem of states not having currency sovereignty to fund things, but you also have the problem of real limitations in what this will allow to happen in the majority of the country in land area. And also how deeply divisive this would be in, quote, purple states, or states with high rural and urban populations. There are outlier states. I live in one of them, that are highly urbanized. Utah is highly urbanized, believe it or not, because a lot of Utah is uninhabitable and or federal land. So there's a ton of people in a very small space, and we have both very conservative urban areas, the area around Provo and Utah County, and very liberal urban areas where I live, and Salt Lake City. And we have a Republican Party that is basically the right wing of the Democrats on one side and Trump sympathetic on the other, split up with a moderate conservative quasi-theocratic Mormon pressure group here, where the LDS are kind of in line with the Romney Republicans as far as like most of where the old men of the church are. And remember, the old men of the church here is literally a gerontocracy. The oldest member of the quorum of the 12 is literally the speaker of the is the prophet. Yeah. Anyway, my point on this in Mormonism is that leads to kind of a inter-GOP fight with kind of finance level Dems running SLC. You see this in a lot of like Western states where these weird pockets like this and weird cultural enclaves that are really close to each other. The rest of the country isn't like this. And for example, Georgia, this is divided up more on racial lines, with the professional suburbs going in different directions depending on who they think is basically weirder and a bigger threat to civic stability. Now, my point in all this isn't to predict what's going to happen in the future. I don't know if the GOP is going to try to enact 2025, and I don't know if Trump's going to win anymore. I was fairly certain about it till about 2 weeks ago. There, however, is still the problem with the Democrats' own power base. It seems that they are moving more and more towards the center, which means towards the right. That it's been clear that all those breadcrumbs for progressives and democratic socialists were breadcrumbs that were sheepdogging, and that you shouldn't trust them, and that you shouldn't trust people trying to use Project 2025 as a threat against democracy either. But you should look at it for where the GOP activist base really wants. At least what parts of it really want. Like I said, it's a wish list. I've wondered why liberals can't produce such a wish list. There's no wish list that tries to promise everything to everybody in the liberal world. There's no think progress version of Project 2025, which is actually kind of absurd to think about it, because literally since 2016, it seems like the only thing Democrats have been able to argue for is that they are not Republicans leaning into pure negative partisanship. Now, negative partisanship has been an increasing part of the American political landscape. There are structural reasons for it, including things like getting rid of port barrel spending, which allows different minor level bourgeoisie and local communities to compromise with each other and not be solely sorted on ideological lines. It was a materialist way of kind of open horse trading that was, yes, corruption, but allowed people to make compromises and get something for their compromises. When you've gotten rid of that, there's no way to do that anymore. And that means that the bourgeoisie's ideological fever dreams and its elite underclass's ideological fever dreams, whether they be professionals or petit bourgeois, and what kind of professional and petit bourgeois really does align to partisan alignment pretty strongly. These things are going to be a bigger problem for any realignment. And realignment is happening because there's a fundamental change in the larger social economic world. Globalization is breaking down. The extent of globalization was always overstated. Most people trade primarily with trade partners that are in their immediate vicinity. The United States, our biggest trade partners have been Canada and Mexico, and it makes total sense. Also, by the way, this is why integration of Canadian and Mexican leftism is actually important to American leftists, but that's beyond today. My point here is that Project 2025 is not something people should fear as a threat to democracy, but it is also not a nothing burger completely. Yes, it seems to be a bait and switch to get people into conservative staffing. But remember that people in the conservative staffing getting placed will believe in parts of this. And it tells you what they think an ideal goals are, and it is very different from the demagogic rhetoric you'll get at the RNC. And there are a lot of conservatives who realize this and realize there's a battle for this within their own ranks. I know a lot of conservatives who were mad at the appointment of J.D. Vance. It made the demagoguery more obvious. Now, they'll defend J.D. Vance in public against leftists because they have a larger memory, but they're mad, which is probably why J.D. Vance started with negatives out of the gate, which was not the case with like Sarah Palin or Dan Quayle. Now, it's easy to get lost in the weeds here, and I don't want you to do that. Wait, remember, this is not a punditry show. This is an analysis show. We have to ask ourselves, why is there a staffing crisis? What is going on with the administrative state? Why is this in such a bad disarray? Because the Biden administration didn't totally repair it at all. And we saw immediately breakdowns in competency, which cannot be blamed on Biden's own age. See, Buttigieg's tenure as Secretary of Transportation, are the total inability of the Department of Education to be able to deal with, handle, and address things they're trying to do with the courts and have backup plans for when they go south. It's led to, even for me personally, fiscal instability and unable to predict the cost for a lot of people, and a lot of people feeling defaults and whatever, which hasn't happened yet, but it might. And this also means that things that are not normally as partisan are being made partisan issues. So you'll see MAGA people taking incoherent statements about like why forgiving PPP loans is good, but while forgiving student loans is bad. Something, employers, something. You know, these are instrumental, logical things to deal with spite and for useful idiots for various factions of the bourgeoisie and their downstream elites. But we also have to admit that a lot of the liberal obsession on Project 2025, even if Trump distanced himself from it and the Heritage Foundation actually boots people associated with this building because they've done their purpose, they've built their staffing pool. You know, why they want you to believe that they're actually going to try to do this verbatim, despite the fact that Trump also had policy papers in the 2016 election that he immediately jettisoned. Demagogues are demagogic, and Trump does have a reptile brain feeling for what is popular and what is acceptable in his base. We have to ask ourselves, what about larger capital relations and what forms of decadence is bringing about this realignment? What political log jams and legal constructions, as well as funding and who's funding what, is allowing for it? That is far more important than you getting into any talking points about Project 2025. Because you'll probably get egg on your face about what they're actually going to try to do. And hell, things have been so chaotic lately that I don't feel comfortable making predictions even about the immediate future because I've been wrong. I, for example, said that I didn't think Biden was going to be forced to step down. The Democrats were going to go down with that ship. Well, apparently the donors said something and it stopped. But a lot of the belief, for example, around people who are trying to deal with the Democratic Party and radicalizing their socialism around it, also deals with them trying to pretend that they can like deal with these centrists in a way that will move them towards the left. I have no idea how they would do that and what money and organization they would do that with. And I bring this up because I want to tell you that just because liberals are weaponizing something, it doesn't mean you can't learn something from what they're weaponizing. Anyway, I hope you learn from this and put this in perspective. The project for a new American century wasn't achieved totally either. And in fact, the courts have given both dreams of Project 2025 and the project for a new American century part of what they want. All right. Good luck. Keep your peace. Like and subscribe. Hit the bell. We have a Patreon if you want more. Have a great day.